Welcome back to The Explainer. So, when you picture the two world wars, what comes to mind? Probably generals hunching over maps, brilliant tactical maneuvers, and, immense human bravery on the battlefield. But today, we're actually going to look past the battlefield. We're going to use a completely different lens, a totally data-driven analysis of how these massive 20th century conflicts were actually fought and won. We're diving into the spreadsheets, the factory lines, and the deep economic currents that literally decided the fate of empires. All right, let's kick things off by challenging some of those hot-blooded myths of war. Check out this quote from economist Raymond Goldsmith, who actually helped manage the U.S. war economy. He states that the cold figures of output, the sheer volume of planes, tanks, and guns produced, tell the true story of the conflict. He's basically saying that what ultimately saved the Allies wasn't just battlefield heroism, it was their incredible capacity to just vastly outproduce the Axis. Which brings us to a pretty provocative question. Did economics, rather than generals, actually win the world wars? It's a jarring thought, right? It totally strips away the romance of military history and replaces it with industrial output and gross domestic product. But as we'll see from the data, those economic fundamentals acted like an inescapable gravity that eventually just pulled the weaker powers down to defeat. So here's our roadmap for today. First, we're going to establish the theory behind these cold figures of war. Then we'll apply that to World War I, looking at a really interesting phenomenon called peasant secession. After that, we'll shift over to the economic overdrive of World War II. We will then examine the glaring exception to the rule, the Soviet Union, before finally wrapping up with the economic aftermath and convergence that followed both of these global conflicts. Let's jump right into Section 1, the cold figures of war. Now, historians really love to write about tactical genius and unbreakable morale, but here's the stark mathematical reality. During the era of total war, nations poured unprecedented chunks of their national income into the fight, basically turning their entire civilian populations into cogs of the military machine. When you've got multi-million-man armies in the field for years at a time, taking appalling losses without completely breaking down, morale actually just becomes a constant. And when the human element holds steady, the sheer volume of stuff, the GDP, the factory output, the agricultural efficiency, that becomes the absolute deciding factor. But, it's not just about raw size, it's about the quality of the economy. Think of it as a multiplier effect. Peacetime economic development, basically your average real income or GDP per capita, acts as a massive multiplier for a nation's raw size when it's time to mobilize. So, a massive but impoverished empire, actually way weaker than a moderately sized wealthy nation. Why? Because richer countries can mobilize production, public finance, and soldiers wildly out of proportion to their baseline size. Simply put, a rich society has the surplus needed to fight, a subsistence society just doesn't. Which leads us to Section 2, World War I, and a fascinating concept called peasant secession. To see exactly how this economic multiplier effect played out on the ground in the first global conflict, let's look at the late summer of 1914. Both sides were hoping for a quick victory, but the resource imbalance was just staggering right from the get-go. By November 1914, the Allies had access to 5 times the population, 11 times the territory, and 3 times the total output of the Central Powers. If you judge purely by economic size and those cold figures of production, the Central Powers were mathematically doomed from day one. And here is a statistic that absolutely blew my mind. 89-1. That was the Allied superiority in tanks over the Central Powers. The Allies rolled out nearly 9,000 tanks. The Central Powers? They produced just 100. As the war dragged on and weapons got more complex, the staggering weight of the Allied industrial advantage literally crushed their opponents. So, why did the poorer nations collapse so completely? It all comes down to a chain reaction known as the peasant secession. Think about it like this. War takes young men and horses away from the farms. At the same time, factories stop making everyday consumer goods so they can build weapons. Now, if you are a peasant farmer in, say, Russia or Austria-Hungary, why on earth would you sell your extra food for money that literally can't buy you anything? You wouldn't. You just retreat to subsistence farming. The food gets locked up in the countryside, the cities starve, and the nation collapses from the inside out. That is exactly what doomed empires like Russia, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottomans. And the historical data backs this up perfectly. If you map GDP per head against changes in real GDP between 1913 and 1917, a really clear trend emerges. The wealthier nations, clustered over on the right like the US and the UK, successfully boosted their real GDP even under the massive pressure of war. But the poorer nations on the left, they suffered devastating economic contractions. Being poor was a fatal liability in a total war.
Moving on to Section 3, World War II and Economic Overdrive.
Now, initially, the Axis powers had terrifying military dominance. But those cold figures, they inevitably reasserted themselves. The conflict basically unfolded in two phases. From 1939 to 1941, Germany and Japan used strategy, readiness, and sheer fighting power to absolutely hammer an economically superior combination of nations. But they failed to get a decisive victory. And that failure opened the door to Phase 2, a brutal war of attrition. Once it became a grinding war of production, superior military tactics started to matter a whole lot less than superior wealth, size, and massive resource pulling, like the U.S. Lend-Lease program, which pumped industrial goods and equipment into Britain and the Soviet Union.
By 1942, Axis territorial expansion hit its absolute peak. Yet, even at their strongest, they were completely dwarfed. The big three allies, the UK, the USA, and the USSR, had nearly double the population, double the economic output, and over 20 times the territory of Germany, Italy, and Japan. Honestly, all the allies had to do was just not lose. Given enough time, their massive economic preponderance pretty much guaranteed a win.
And exactly like we saw in World War I, wealth dictated resilience. Looking at the real GDP change from 1938 to 1942, the exact same pattern repeats itself. Under the insane pressure of total war, rich countries expanded their economies, while poor ones tended to disintegrate. The poorer they were, the harder they fell. Which brings us to Section 4, the Soviet Union anomaly. Okay, so there is one glaring exception to literally everything we've just talked about: the Soviet Union. If we compare the pre-war wealth of the big three allies, the disparity is huge. The United States and the UK were wealthy, highly developed nations. The Soviet Union, on the other hand, was incredibly poor, with a GDP per capita of only around $2,000. Based on the rules of the multiplier effect we just learned, the USSR absolutely should have collapsed entirely under the strain of the German invasion. I mean, remember, Russia did collapse due to peasant secession in the First World War. So how did the USSR survive the Second World War despite taking such massive, devastating losses? Well, the grim reality is that Stalin's brutal pre-war collectivization of agriculture fundamentally changed the math. By seizing absolute state control over the food supply, the Soviet state essentially prevented that peasant secession from happening again. This horrifying level of control allowed a poor country to carry a disproportionately massive military burden. We're talking an astonishing 61% of its entire economy mobilized for war. When you look at the fiscal mobilization data for World War II, the USSR is sitting way up there, isolated on the left. It's a total anomaly. It shows a staggering level of economic mobilization for such a low-income nation, levels usually only achievable by much, much richer countries. It was a structural exception forged through immense internal suffering, but it's what kept the Soviet war machine running. Finally, let's wrap up with Section 5, Aftermath and Economic Convergence.
So, with so much human and physical capital completely destroyed, what did the economic recovery look like? A really striking trend emerges when you look at the aftermath of both wars. The data tells a super surprising story. The economies that were the most damaged, the ones that saw the greatest drop in average income during the fighting, actually recovered the most rapidly in the decades that followed. Over a long enough timeline, the negative economic effects of all that destruction were largely transitory.
But there is a massive difference in the long-term global results between the two wars. After World War I, there was almost no global economic convergence. Poor countries stayed poor and rich countries stayed rich. After World War II, though, we saw strong convergent economic growth. Why? Because this time, the victorious Allies designed a much better, far more integrated international economic environment after 1945, compared to the really punitive measures they put in place in 1918. As we close out this explainer today, I want to leave you with a rather chilling thought, drawn right from our source material. The whole era of total war, where sheer economic mass basically decided the victor, that might have been entirely unique to the period between 1914 and 1945. Think about it. Today, nuclear weapons can give devastating, world-ending force to any moderately wealthy country for just a few $billion. So the real question is, in the atomic age, do the cold figures of macroeconomic warfare still decide our fate? Or has technology completely rewritten the rules? Think on that for a bit. Thanks so much for joining me today, and keep learning.